I'm really wishing I played the banjo right now, but it's pretty amazing to be here at TED. I guess I'm last, so let's begin. About a month ago, I was tucking my kids into bed, and I asked them this question that's up here. What 3 things do all humans need in their life every day? And I'm kind of asking you to think about what you would answer that question. But I guess when I asked my kids, I'm going to tell you what their answer was at the end of this, but when I asked my kids that question, I was really thinking in my own head what the answer that I thought was probably what they were going to say, and that's food, water, and shelter. Obviously, I'm an architect, so shelter is near and dear to my heart. But the more I started to think about that word shelter, I realized that as an architect, I actually don't use that word day in, day out in my practice, in my day-to-day life. I talk about buildings and I talk about projects, but I don't really talk about shelter. And I guess the reason I don't talk about shelter is because, for the most part, we all in the developed world have the luxury of not actually having to think about these 3 things each morning when we wake up. We have that luxury of not having to think about shelter. And I really have been reflecting a lot on that fact. Now, as an architect, this is actually what I do. These are the buildings that my practice, MGB Architecture, build. And these are just a few of them. But the way I think about the practice of architecture is a little bit like building one building at a time, designing and working on one building at a time. In each of the buildings that we do, I kind of feel like it's sort of like climbing a hill. With a big team of people, we get together and have to climb this hill and go through this long process of designing the building with engineers, other architects, with our client and the community. And each time that we climb those individual hills, we get to the top and we've finished a building, and we all feel good. Hopefully it's been responsible to the environment, and hopefully it's been responsible to our clients' needs and the community's needs. And we sort of look down on the hill that we've climbed, and we feel good about ourselves, and we feel good about that accomplishment. And that's really been what my career, and I think the career of many architects, is about, one hill at a time that we climb. There's a moment about 4 years ago for me that was really important. It was a moment when a really dear friend of mine tapped me on the shoulder, and she said to me, "You know, Michael, it's really great that you've climbed that hill and had a successful building. Congratulations on that. But have you ever turned around and looked at these mountain ranges that sort of lie ahead of you? Mountain ranges that are unclimbed mountains. And these huge, huge mountain ranges, in my mind and in her mind at the time, were these 2 things: world housing and climate change." And the more I started to think about that, I realized that these are really the problems that face architects today. This is the big problem to solve, these 2 mountain ranges. And the reality is that these 2 mountain ranges actually collide, and they make an even bigger mountain range. And the reality is that as we work hard to solve world housing, if we do it using the technology of building that we have today, the reality is that we're going to accelerate climate change. So in other words, what's going to happen is that we're going to solve one human need and in turn actually make another, which obviously can't happen. So I'm going to walk you through a bit of a story about how these things relate to each other. I'm going to take you first through world housing. There's a staggering statistic that exists, and we don't talk about it every day in our sort of popular culture. But the staggering statistic that exists, and this comes from UN Habitat, is that 3 billion people in the world are going to need a new affordable home in the next 20 years. 3 billion people. And that reflects the reality that, of course, world population is growing. And it also reflects the reality that 1 billion people in the world today live in slums and urban environments. 100 million people live homeless around the world today, effectively homeless. That's 3 Canadas of population that live homeless worldwide. Now, obviously, as an architect, and we return to that issue of shelter, this is the problem that we need to solve. This is the focus that we should have throughout our profession. Because 3 billion people reflects 40% of the world. This is the biggest building problem in the world. This is 100,000 new homes each and every day that we need to build to be able to solve this incredible human need. And most of those homes, of course, are going to exist in the developing world, with some here as well. The thing about it is that in today's popular conversation that exists in the architectural media and the mainstream media, you hear a lot of conversation both about climate issues and housing issues, and the kinds of solutions that are largely talked about are issues like modular homes and prefabricated homes, or stacking shipping containers in interesting ways, or using wonderful materials like rammed earth or straw bale construction to be able to kind of solve these issues of both climate and housing. But the truth is that for the most part, all of those types of solutions that we talk about in the mainstream media are all rural or at best suburban type solutions. The reality is that today, 50% of the world live in urban environments. And in the next 40 years, what's going to happen is that we'll see that rise to 70%. The vast majority of that rise in urbanization worldwide is going to happen in the developing world. So it's a staggering reality that the kinds of solutions that we discuss day in, day out are actually not as applicable to the place that the majority of that 3 billion people that need a new affordable home are actually going to ultimately live. The split, and the way I like to sort of graphically think about it, is 85-15. 15% of the world's population live in the 35 most developed, highly developed countries in the world. Feedback. 15% of that population. 85% live effectively in what we would call developing nations. So the vast majority clearly live in these countries. Now, we also know that of the 15% that live in those richest countries of the world, they build the majority of buildings today. The amount of square meters per person, the amount of square feet per person that's built for the 15% of the world's population is enormous. And if we were to build for the 3 billion people, the quantity of buildings and the quantity of area that we build today already in these highly developed nations, we would be off the charts, that bottom gray bar, with the number of buildings we would ultimately build and the amount of space we would ultimately build, which obviously creates this question of how does that ultimately impact climate change. So let me talk about that. Buildings represent an enormous contributor to environmental impact in many different ways. And obviously, when it comes to climate change, are huge contributors. And when we talk about climate change, for the most part, it's the greenhouse gas number that's up there. I'm showing a range because it's really challenging at times to be statistically specific about some of these issues. But roughly 20% of world carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas that we talk most about, comes from the building industry. So buildings have a responsibility that is huge in tackling. The reality of that is that energy and the amount of energy to heat and cool homes is a huge contributing factor. But energy solutions are going to vary as we look at the map of the world from region to region. Obviously, climate issues are completely different. How we solve an energy solution for a building in Canada is going to be quite different than the middle of Australia where it's hot and dry. So those solutions are going to be more regional type solutions to this problem. But the one thing that I think has become really interesting is that when you look at urban environments, for the most part, the solutions are common from city to city, from nation to nation, all around the world. We build the same way. The structures of what we build are the same around the world. And so that's really become the focus of what I'm interested in sort of talking about. The two materials that we build with today in all of these urban environments, for the most part, are steel and concrete masonry. And we build with a few others, brick and so forth, but for the most part, these are our dominant materials. And in the developing world, the dominant material in urban environments is certainly concrete. Now, there's a whole conversation to be had about what that means as far as safety and natural disasters and so forth, and I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to stay away from that conversation today. But what I want to talk about is really the impact on the environment of these two materials and the way we need to begin to think about them. Now, concrete, I think this is an incredible thing to kind of get our heads around, is after water, concrete is the largest material man makes by volume on Earth. It is a staggering amount of concrete we make each year. It's roughly 3 tons of concrete per person on Earth are made every single year. And that's obviously for infrastructure and for buildings. The making of concrete is extremely energy intensive. Moving it and so forth is very heavy. It's very carbon intensive. And the best way to describe where it sort of stacks up in the world of carbon, which is our dominant climate change discussion, is to kind of look at what its impact relative to other industries are. So the airline industry we talk about all the time. It's always coming up. It's roughly 1% of world carbon comes from the airline industry, and this is probably, I think, one of the most common discussions you see in the mainstream media. The shipping industry is 3% of world carbon, and that's a staggering amount, and 15% of world carbon actually is related to all transportation, but shipping itself is 3%. But what's really staggering is this reality that 5 to 8% of world carbon comes from concrete alone. It's an incredible carbon footprint, but we don't have a lot of alternatives, and that's what I'm going to go into. Steel, which we don't see as much of, is a little bit better from a carbon footprint point of view, but is actually more demanding from an energy point of view. Steel and the production of iron are about 4% of world energy goes into the making of that material alone. So really, obviously, the question becomes, what are our alternatives? And any alternative that we think about ultimately has to do the two things that we always have to do when we're talking about tackling climate change and carbon. We need to reduce our emissions, and we need to find ways to store carbon. Those are our two options to really be able to tackle the issues. And in the building industry, there's only really a few materials that do that, and this is it. Wood does both those two things. Wood is a material that's grown by the sun, uses the energy of the sun. While a tree is growing, it's putting oxygen into the system, it's extracting carbon from the system. When a tree falls to the forest floor and it rots or burns in a fire, that carbon is given back to the atmosphere. But when a tree is felled in the forest and taken and used in a building or in a piece of furniture or something like that, what it does is it actually holds on to the carbon for the life of that, whatever it's been built into. Okay? And it holds on to the carbon in roughly this equation. For every cubic meter of wood that we use in a building, it stores about a ton of carbon. Whereas any other material choice we have in the building industry is actually contributing carbon, wood is something that extracts carbon. A way to sort of get your head around that is the average Canadian home made of wood basically is storing 28 tons of carbon, which is about the equivalent of driving a family car for 7 years. So when we stack up wood, steel, and concrete as our three options of what we could actually build with and tackle this issue of what's going to happen in urban environments in the future, from a greenhouse gas point of view, from an energy point of view, really wood is our best choice. But there's a big but. For the most part, a huge contributor to climate change that we know has been deforestation over the last 50 years. Deforestation has happened primarily in the developing world around issues of clearing land to create higher value crops or cutting down trees to use wood for fuel. That deforestation and this subtraction of the forest that's been supplying the oxygen to the atmosphere has been a huge problem. Obviously, we don't want to cut down trees in that way, and obviously we want to start thinking about how we can create a better and more sustainable forest management plan for the world. Roughly 10% of our world forests are actually reasonably well managed from a sustainability point of view, and that can change. By using wood in buildings in some of these developing nations, instead of burning it as fuel or clear-cutting it for a higher value crop, we can actually teach communities to build with the wood in new ways to actually encourage them to consider wood as a renewable resource and a renewable economic driver for their community. And that's an important part of our solution. So the other challenge with wood is this reality that we build with wood basically the same way we have for 300 years or more. We really haven't innovated in wood. The Industrial Revolution brought us steel and concrete, and largely we build with those materials without thinking as architects. We immediately jump in as our easy solution, and wood is something that we really haven't innovated with because the steel and concrete were able to allow us to build bigger buildings, longer bridges, and so forth. So we haven't really thought about it as a material of great capacity. So when we go back to those two mountain ranges that I talk about housing, world housing and climate change, what they create for us is a new challenge, a new opportunity that really is going to be driven by a new sense of innovation for us to start thinking about how we make a systemic change in the way we actually build in urban environments. And that's a hard thing to do when it comes from architects and engineers who are largely driving practices with very small mom and pop shop scale companies. It's hard for us to step way back and look at how we can contribute as individuals towards that large systemic change, but we can. But what we need is to kind of change the sense of ambition that we have about our opportunity and our role in society as architects and engineers. I think there's a really amazing thing that when you hand a small child a group of wood blocks, that likely that child is going to stack them up and see how high a building or how high an object that they can make. It's somehow innate to us to do that. That when you hand somebody a bunch of rocks, they're going to probably pile them up and see what they can make out of them. There's something, ingrained in us as people that we are interested and curious in what we can do to build things. Just the other day, this week, I actually came downstairs to find my son Maclu has built this tower in our house and was very proud of it and wanted his picture taken. Wanted it included in TED, by the way. But it's in us. It's in all of us to want to do that. But the strange and curious thing that's happened is really we've created all kinds of rules and regulations throughout the developed world to prevent our ability to actually innovate. And I think it's a fascinating thing that could be applied to many other industries and not just the building industry, but I use a few examples to describe what I mean by that. In British Columbia, until 2 years ago, we were only allowed by the British Columbia Building Code to build wood buildings 4 stories tall. That was our limit. And a lot of people worked really hard on trying to change the code and ultimately did, and now we're allowed to build wood buildings that are 6 stories tall. Now, the thing about it is that about the same time that was happening, changing our code, a good friend of mine, Andrew Waugh from Waugh Thistle in London, England, had already built a wood building that's 9 stories tall. So our code wasn't even keeping up with what was happening as common practice elsewhere. The really staggering thing, though, was that I was riding my bike with my son Maclu across Japan when the code change went through, and somebody from my office emailed me and told me the story. Hey, 6-story code is now passed in British Columbia. We can build taller wood buildings. And I quickly emailed back that that was great. On the other hand, I just walked out of a building that is roughly 19 stories tall. And more importantly, that building was built 1,400 years ago. It was made out of wood in a high earthquake zone in a similar climate and is still standing. And it really begs the question, why have we created regulation that can't even keep up with what we were able to do 1,400 years ago? And how have we created systems over the last 100 years that, for some strange reason, completely stifle our ability to be innovative and solve the real problems that we clearly have to solve? The other way I kind of like to tell that story is with this slide. And I kind of ask the question, especially to architects and engineers, of what would have happened if Cairo had said, stone buildings in Cairo can only be 20 meters tall. Well, obviously, we would never had the Great Pyramid. And the Great Pyramid stood as the tallest building on Earth for 5,000 years. Until what would have happened had Paris said you could only build a wrought iron building 20 meters tall. Well, obviously, we would never have had the Eiffel Tower. Our ability to dream big is a function of our ability to solve problems and to innovate. But when we create these glass ceilings for ourselves, we no longer can think that way, and we need to remove that. Currently, as far as I've been able to research, and my friends have helped me research, the tallest wood building in the world is actually, modern wood building in the world is actually this one, and it's in Russia. And it was built by the gentleman here with the fur cap. Oops, I'm going to go backwards. And it's 13 stories tall. There's a lot of funny stories to go with it, and I welcome you to look it up on the internet. But the interesting story here clearly is, if the fellow with the fur cap can manage to build a 13-story wood building, surely architects and engineers around the world can jump on board and keep up. It's an important story. And the truth is, people are keeping up. So the fun thing that's starting to happen, and you're going to see more and more, I hope, and we're trying to encourage more and more to happen, is that different countries around the world, different architects, different clients, different engineers are starting to explore the possibility of how to build big wood buildings. buildings that will actually be able to address this human need in urban environments in a more sustainable way. And that's happening in a kind of fun way. I think it's a little bit like the race for space that's happening in the SpaceX Prize. And I think that spirit of competition that existed 100 years ago when the big towers were starting to pop up in New York and the different skylines around the world, which seem like follies, but in reality, those big towers and those big sort of gestures of what was possible, the dreaming big, became a motivation for us to problem solve, a competition for us to problem solve. And I think here in Canada, we should be part of that competition, and that innovation should be something that we're excited about and that we can chase more in our day-to-day lives. Because the solutions ultimately do exist already. We really actually know how to do many of these things, and yet we've for some reason forgotten that we know these things. FFTT, which stands for Finding the Forest Through the Trees, is a system that we've designed that is not glamorous. It's a way to build tall wood buildings really economically to be able to tackle exactly what I'm talking about. How do we build for that massive human need? And many other systems like this are possible and are being explored, but we're not doing this fast enough, and we're not investing in these kinds of investigations fast enough. Because ultimately what we realize is this is a bit of a race. How do we get to that 3 billion people that need those houses if we don't make a systemic change in a very fast way? And the way that change is going to happen ultimately is because the reality is the big problems also are incredibly big opportunities. The nation that leads this charge to chase those 100,000 new homes each and every day and chase them in these new systems is the nation that will ultimately win economically as well. The companies that do, the individuals that do, will actually see that economic reward for doing something that ultimately many of us feel is an altruistic and meaningful gesture to fellow man. So we started an organization called How's the World, which is really an organization just to support and encourage doing just that. And we set out some goals for ourselves of what that would be, but it's really about how to create carbon neutral structures. And the first 3 goals I think are realistic, and I think the second 3 goals are going to maybe take quite a long time. Maybe a lifetime. But for the most part, we want to encourage that level of innovation, and we have a huge incentive to contribute towards it. Now, at the beginning of the conversation, I mentioned that I was tucking my kids into bed, and I asked that question, what 3 things does everybody on Earth need each day in their lives? And my daughter, Elsa, there on the right, left, answered the question a little bit to my surprise, and of course proved me wrong once again, as both my kids often do. And she answered food, water, just like I had originally. But the third answer she said was love. And then she chimed in, of course, Dad, shelter can be number 4 if you really have to have shelter on the list. But she's right? That's really the right answer. And I went around asking other people that question, and I mentioned in the beginning that person that tapped me on the shoulder and said, it's great you've climbed these hills and you've done these individual buildings, but what are you going to do about these massive mountain chains? And when I asked her the question, her answer was love, laughter, sushi. I don't know what it means, but I thought it was funny. Thank you very much.